Hello and welcome to ESG Talk, your go-to source for insights and advice from leaders in environment, social, and governance. I'm your host, Mandy McReynolds, and I am thrilled today to have in studio Chad Reed. Now, Chad is also a fellow podcaster on HASI's Climate Positive podcast, so he has experienced being in a studio like us. And then he is also the Vice President of Strategic Initiatives and ESG at HASI. So similar like me, a practitioner that enjoys talking to different individuals about how we address the future of business and society together. Chad, welcome to the show. Thanks for coming on and joining us today.
Thank you so much, Mandy. It's really great to be here.
So let's dive right in, because as you and I had this discussion about HASI, they were setting new standards as it relates to transparency and accountability in ESG reporting. And one of the things that I found fascinating in our discussion is you talked about it being the first publicly traded company in the U.S. to report avoided emissions. Let me repeat that for those listening into the show. The first to report avoided emissions. For those who are trying to understand what that means, that's a financial disclosure that oftentimes financial services and asset managers are still struggling through today trying to do. So I wanted to bring Chad on because this has a significant impact to both societal measurements and financial measurements, especially for financial service companies. And those who aren't in financial service companies could take a little bit away. So Chad, as we start this dialogue and discussion, can you tell us, how did HASI start this ESG journey? They were so forward-looking in being able to report emissions. And what does that look like for you today, now what you've learned over being kind of a leader in this space?
Yeah, thank you so much, Mandy. It is a source of pride for the company. So we went public about 10 years ago in 2013. And the mission of our company was to invest in sustainable infrastructure. And so from the beginning of our journey as a public company, we had a sustainability investment policy in place whereby we are only allowed to invest in projects that have avoided carbon emissions or other environmental benefits such as water savings. And so it's really been baked into the DNA of our company, again, since we went public about 10 years ago. And what avoided emissions mean in this context? So we're investing in real assets typically. So many folks may not be familiar with that term, but it's really infrastructure projects like wind generation facilities or solar farms or building efficiency projects or now renewable natural gas and fleet decarbonization projects. So we only invest in these projects that are real assets that have avoided carbon emissions associated with them. And from the very beginning, we've said it's important for us to quantify that, right? It's important for us to demonstrate to our investors and to other stakeholders that we are having a positive impact on the environment through each and every one of our investments. And the way we had traditionally done that is the EPA has average annual emission factors that it releases every year through what's, I believe, called the eGrid system. And we had been using those average annual emission factors. Then we would multiply those factors by the megawatt hours that we would anticipate the project would generate on an annual basis or save if it's an energy efficiency project. And then we divide that product by the total capital cost of the project. And that gets us what we like to call carbon count. And that is the metric tons of CO2 avoided per $1,000 invested. And so we've reported the carbon count associated with each and every one of our investments every year since we've been a public company in what was traditionally called our sustainability report card. So we've been doing that for several years now. And this goes a bit beyond the existing greenhouse gas protocol, scope 1, 2, and 3. We're attempting to have an influence on that process and to get avoided emissions incorporated into that process and then those standards. But to date, it's kind of like a scope 4 or additional disclosure that we make in addition to our scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions disclosures, which we also make.
What I appreciate about that journey is we are seeing more and more, particularly as we talk with different companies on their private to public journey and getting ready and preparing for capital markets. And we know that's going to come back. The capital markets are going to come back. They're starting right now to integrate their financial reporting and they're going public journey with ESG reporting. Some of it is because they're getting ready for regulation. Others of it is the market differentiation that they can have and access to new capital. So I think it's really interesting from the inception of your company to think with that lens, that HASI came out and thought with that lens. I'm curious, as you look back, what would be something you would do differently? You know, we on the show acknowledge, hey, we all learn through failure. We all learn through mistakes. We all learn through going through it, being sometimes the innovators. What would you do differently as an innovator?
Yeah, I joined the company about 3.5 years ago, and our former CEO and now executive chair, Jeff Eckel, had the foresight to bake this into the DNA of our company. So I want to recognize him in this effort as well. But one thing that we more recently tried to do is to one, we've improved the carbon count metric. We now use locational marginal emission factors. So instead of looking at the emissions on an annual basis, we increasingly are trying to look at the avoided emissions on a hourly basis and at the nodal level. So very locationally specific, not just at a state level. We're going down to what's called the nodal level. And so we've made that improvement to carbon count, and we have partnerships with a company called Resurety that's helping to develop that data, as well as a nonprofit called Watt Time that is also helping to develop that data. And those partnerships have been key to improving our carbon count metric, and we just released the Carbon Count 2.0 white paper that you can find on our website that details this new methodology. But and we're finally getting traction now. We've actually joined a partnership, co-founded a partnership actually called the Emissions First Partnership. And that is a partnership of some of the leading corporate buyers out there, like Amazon and Meta, as Salesforce, as well as a few others, and some investors like ourselves. And we're trying to have an influence on the greenhouse gas protocols, scope 2, especially methodology. And in part to try to incorporate these locational marginal emission factors and ultimately some sort of carbon count metric into those that broader array of standards that the Greenhouse Gas Protocol had initially developed, I think, in 2015 under leadership of WRI, the World Resources Institute. And so in terms of what we've learned over the years is we really need to build coalitions to get these new sustainability reporting metrics out there, widely adopted, recognized by investors. About, by our estimates, a third of our shares are in the hands of investors who have some sort of ESG lens in their investing process. And that's been, I think, a differentiator for our company since the very beginning. And so it's definitely been helpful. But we haven't been quite as successful as making this carbon count metric and locational marginal emission factor methodology more widespread until we more recently have tried to build these coalitions. And I think these corporate coalitions and coalitions with nonprofits, NGOs, the leading ones out there, like Watt Time in this case, like the Rocky Mountain Institute, which is we're working with as well on this topic. Those coalitions are key to creating new standards and credibility around sustainability reporting.
I think what's interesting that you uncovered there is a lesson learned about what part of activism do you play. And activism can break down from some public policy engagement to the ratings and the rankings and the more looking at the framework of calculation, as well as this coalition building. And I would encourage our listeners, as we start to disclose more to stakeholders, that's what stakeholders are interested in. That's what I'm seeing in the market. What I'm hearing from our own stakeholders is they want you to use your superpower to make a difference. Just recently, I was at the Boston College Center for Corporate Citizenship, and we were talking with GRI, and we were talking about it's so important that these organizations like Greenhouse Gas Protocol, GRI, for companies as their stakeholder to engage, to really step up and talk about what's needed so that we can have accurate and comparable measurability. Investors can make informed decisions, and stakeholders have some form of consistency across the board. So I love that as a takeaway for our audience is be transparent about the coalitions, be transparent of what you have to work on, and really think about where you engage in activism in order to create broader change. So one thing that I think is interesting on your disclosure and on your website, you talk about the alignment to the concept of double materiality. And we'll put that in the show notes. We've done some sessions on and some segments on double materiality. Tell us a little bit about why you chose the difference between materiality versus double materiality, and how has that informed your ESG strategy?
Yeah, that's a great question. To go through the differences between single and double materiality, obviously there are any number of factors that can influence the financial prospects of a business or company. When it comes to ESG, one thing that many companies have started doing, which is fantastic, is what environmental, social, and governance factors can have an influence on our business, right? So environmental is often climate change, right? Our emissions, or climate change has an impact on assets that we own. It has, especially if they're in areas with subject to climate risk, whether that's wildfire or flooding or other extreme weather events. And so we need to start thinking about where our assets are positioned, where our headquarters is positioned, and ensuring that we are well insulated and protecting ourselves from the changes that climate change will bring to the communities in which we operate. So that's one way that folks look at the materiality of E on a single materiality basis to their business. And what we have done, again, since we've been a public company 10 years ago, is, well, it's not just important for us to understand how the climate impacts us. We also need to understand how we impact the climate. And that's precisely what our carbon count metric sought to do from the very beginning, is demonstrate that we are measuring our impact on climate change, our impact of our business, and our business is investing, so we're an investment firm, how our investments are impacting emissions, which ultimately drive climate change.
I think that the interesting part is as you navigate, companies have done really well the E. Unpacking for our audience, the S and the G in double materiality is quite the journey to get to a point where you really prove out the business impact to both business and society. And talking with companies like yours and talking with companies in Europe who are working through this, it is often an 18 to 24 month process, and they're continuously iterating on it. I think that's why I would advocate that we in the field need to be better and better and better about this idea of dual impact. We have to be better and better and better about pulse checking materiality and stakeholder engagement in order to really prove that out to a point where it would pass the test of regulators and investors. When we think about the S, I like that you went into your mission with the collide of environment and social and where you found that intersection for your own business. And I think we're going to see more and more companies try to prove that out. I was on a phone call a couple weeks ago with somebody who was working through this idea of, when I make investment proactively in a specific social area, what is the return on that investment to the business and the long-term cost avoided? And they were able to prove out, I think for every dollar invested, it was like they get a 1.39 back in return or something along those lines. And so I think companies are really going to have to follow your lead and others and start to jump in and show that. As you think about this idea of where companies go with the next frontier, what's on your mind? What's on your mind about what's next?
Yeah, I do think measuring the S is very difficult at times. And for us in our industry, which is, energy infrastructure more broadly. The Inflation Reduction Act was a key piece of legislation that the previous Congress and administration passed and is now implementing. And there are a number of provisions of the Inflation Reduction Act, and so we don't have to be exhaustive and go into each of them. But an important one is a 10% bonus tax credit for projects that are located in 3 different sorts of locations. The first is a brownfield, or an expansion, redevelopment, or reuse of some property that has been contaminated by hazardous substances. The second is coal land, land that has been where there was a mine abandoned within the last couple decades, or there was a coal-fired generating unit that has been retired in the last decade or two. And the third area is an area with high unemployment rate, or gets a certain percentage of its local tax collections from the fossil industry. And so the question is, can we measure the projects that we're investing in and their impact on these sorts of communities, right? That's been the traditional challenge. With the Inflation Reduction Act and this tax credit in place, it actually hopefully makes it a little bit easier in that we can track going forward, or we hope to track going forward, which of our projects are receiving this tax credit, right? And potentially, work with our clients who will be economically incentivized to develop projects in these areas, to ensure that there are more projects developed in these areas, that folks who may have been otherwise left behind in the energy transition, which none of us want, right? We all want to move together forward through the energy transition in an equitable manner. These folks who have lived in fossil or coal communities, who lived in areas with high unemployment or poverty, how can we ensure that we're investing in those communities, and while at the same time creating jobs and improving their local and global environmental impact? So that's just one way that we're looking at, and we're hoping to potentially move forward when it comes to measuring, especially social, or the intersection of social and environmental impact of our business.
I love that example, because I think that can be something that our audience percolates on and thinks deeper about, because your idea of governance and double materiality is thinking about those external laws that then also pull in the impact for you in dual measurement. And that may be a pathway forward for us in the future. And so thank you so much for coming on the show, sharing your journey with us, and how we can think about double materiality, how we can think about the collision of the S, the E, and the G, working it all together. And to our audience, as always, thank you so much for listening and giving us the honor of your time. This episode of ESG Talk was brought to you by Workiva, the world's only unified platform for financial reporting, ESG, audit, and risk. If you enjoyed this episode, we encourage you to check out Chad's podcast, Climate Positive, and please continue sharing ESG Talk with your colleagues and friends. Thanks, everyone. We'll talk real soon.